Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my wonderful interviews. Today we are going to go to sunny Oxfordshire. Apparently it's sunny all over the place, which is rather nice. I've even had to put my waistcoat on and my shirt on just to look decent because we're enjoying some wonderful weather. It is the weather, of course, to be sitting back reading books. And my guest today, like so many people at the moment who are writing books, has just released a very exciting one called No One's Dad is a Plumber. I have a feeling it's not just about plumbing. His name is, of course, Mark Devlin. He's been on the show before, and this is his musical book, Truths number 4. Mark, so lovely to have you. You were here in person last time, but you decided to snub me this time. That's perfectly all right. How are you?
Hello, Richard. Good to connect with you again. Yeah, last year I passed by the studio on my way back from, I think, Hope, Sussex. I was probably down there for that. And I came in the studio. I was admiring your reel-to-reel tape machine in the
Oh,
background there.
yes, it's still. Which one? There it is.
Yeah, I used to work on those on the radio back in the day. We probably talked about this last time. But yeah, don't see many of those around these days.
And unfortunately, the reels here have not moved. Unfortunately, I need to get some fuses or something
Are they
to
just
get
props?
it working. It's well, I used to use it. I used to love it. And the B, that's an A77. I used to love the B77, which is the sort of slightly more pro one up. But they're lovely, lovely machines
Used to love working on those.
with the old
The old
splicer
razor
and
blades.
EMI, yeah, all of that
Yeah,
stuff.
a lost skill.
Absolutely, like so much that's gone digital. But the music industry, I suppose, is one that has changed so much from those early days, where now we have Spotify and other streaming medias, and one of the things I love when meeting people and going into their room, two things I used to love doing, that is looking at their bookcases and seeing the books, the spines on the books, or their music collection. Now both of those seem to have disappeared. You go in and nobody's got books and nobody's got records, or very few.
I used to have what I referred to as my museum out in the garage. It was like a redundant formats museum. So I used to have vinyl records out there, cassette tapes, reel-to-reel tapes, even CDs are fairly redundant these days, magazines, music magazines. And I just realized that all these formats are now gone. And our generation are the last one that is going to have known them, because the current generation has been brought up on digital electronic ways of doing things, and their idea of how music should sound is dictated by MP3s delivered on portable devices through little tinny speakers.
Yes.
And these young people today have, how old do I sound, have no idea how music should really sound listened to on a proper stereo system, played off of vinyl with that full frequency range recording. And the sound that used to come out of those reel-to-reel tape machines was great as well. It was just so faithful to the original recording. And it's just such a shame that these formats have fallen by the
Well,
wayside.
you say there, how old am I? Because it sounds like, lots of decades have got, or even centuries have passed. But the technology from those days of reel-to-reel, from, say, the 1950s, 60s, to where we are today, or 20 years ago when things like MP3s were coming out, has just flown by, so that no sooner had something like the CD come out and they were saying this is the disc of the future, that it was obsolete already.
That's right. I put out my first allegorical novel in 2019 called The Cause and the Cure, and I set it in the early 90s in Oxford. So I had all the action taking place in 1990 and 1991. And part of the point that I was making through the narrative is just how much society has changed technologically in a relatively short period of time. So back in 1990, I had a character in the story that was stuck in the middle of a street in Oxford and needed to make an urgent phone call. And she had to fish around in her pocket for a 50p piece to put it in a call box to use the phone, because back in 1990, nobody had mobile phones, or very few people. And that was still the era of analog tapes and vinyl records and all of this. And fast forward 20 years from then to 2010, I guess, everyone's using mobile phones, everyone's got a laptop or a portable device. So in just 20 years, society has been changed unrecognizably. And that's not a very long period for those major changes to have taken place. And look at where we've come since 2010. Everything now is controlled by AI, it seems, linked up to a smart grid. Anything you ever want to do has to be done online. I mean, my
Yeah.
dad's generation really struggles because he's not interested in computers, just doesn't want to know. But if he wants to book an engineer to come out and fix the gas boiler or fix the internet or something, you've got to go online because there's no other way of doing it unless you want to wait 22 and a half hours for somebody to pick up the phone in India and then not understand what you're saying. So, yeah, it's a real problem for those of an older generation to function in this society. I can just about manage it.
Yes. Well, this is it. I mean, I regale against it, and or I rail against it rather, and things like these symbols here of the past sort of try and keep. I mean, on the other side, you can't really see it terribly. It's an old wireless. I mean, they're from sort of the 1950s.
Right.
Now, talking of old things, I mean, I mentioned it with people's shelves. Books, of course, are those things that again you don't see so many of. And I'm writing a book. You've written several books. Are you finding that people still read?
They do. People of my sort of generation, I feel. What I've found is with all the public talks that I do and the conferences and the podcasts and the books, is that I seem to appeal to a certain demographic. And that demographic is pretty much 50 to 70 years of age. I would really like to reach people below that demographic, but it's a real challenge. So I find myself appealing to people of that kind of generation. And they do seem to still value reading. So people give me feedback and they say it's great to get all the information between the covers of a book, because if the internet ever goes down, that information is still going to be preserved in hard copy format. And for as long as the book survives, of course, books can be burnt, but they can also be secreted away if needs be, then that information lives on. The internet could go down tomorrow. We don't know.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
it's very dangerous to put everything on the cloud and everything online and just rely on it always being there, because one day it might not. So this is still the value of hard copy books. People are still reading books from hundreds of years ago that have been preserved.
Yes.
And
I do.
potentially, right, and potentially books from today could still be getting preserved hundreds of years into the future. So this is why I place so much value on writing books. Evidently you do as well. And there's still definitely a place for them. Not everything has to be digital. Digital has its pitfalls. So hard copy lives on. And that's why I keep churning out books.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there, because once it's printed, it's very hard to change. Although I have heard that places like these online publishers, big ones named after rivers, without sort of being too fine a point on it, where you'll perhaps have an electronic device that links to it. I mean, sometimes the authors don't really know this, from what I understand, is the text, if it's not narrative compliant, let me say, can be changed by somebody else, and that if you're buying a later iteration of that novel, book, whatever, it may not be exactly what the original was intended, and that's rather scary. So that's where the printed thing, and my house is full of books, so it's obviously a fire hazard. But as you say, once it's printed, it's there in black and white.
Right. And what's the
Errors and
name?
all.
What's the name of the electronic book format that company named after a river operates? Kindle, right? And
Yeah.
what do you use a Kindle for? Starting a fire. So
Yeah.
it seems to me like there's an element of mockery there, because they're saying we're burning books now, or we're changing them. Are you familiar with the movie Fahrenheit 451? Did you ever see that?
Yes, a long time ago.
It's kind of dystopian, aren't they
Yeah.
all? And it's a futuristic society where books have been banned, and you have these marshals that go around seizing books and burning them. And apparently, paper burns at 451 Fahrenheit, hence the name of the movie. But that's what it is. It's burning books, burning knowledge, burning wisdom, getting rid of it, destroying the past and any connection with the past. And so it's a warning in that movie of the sort of society that we could be moving towards. And so it just makes it all the more important to preserve books. And that's why we do it.
No, I totally agree. So you have, as you mentioned there, you have written several books, and you're on your number fourth, which has got A nice little title, which will make people smile. Not no one's dad is a plumber, which of course some people will say, "Well, wait a minute, my dad is a plumber."
Well, exactly that. People will say, my mate Dave down the road, his dad's a plumber. Yes, he may well be. But the reference from the title there is towards the music industry. And it's a dynamic which I identified many years ago when I was going through this research. I've written three previous books in the series. And it became very clear to me that when you take prominent musicians, I'm talking about the real A-listers, not every musician out there, but the
Sure.
household names that we're all familiar with. And there are exceptions, but with many of them, you will find that the fathers of these prominent musicians are not what you would have expected them to be, or I wouldn't anyway. So before I started on this research, I would have imagined the fathers of prominent members of rock bands, particularly punk bands, heavy metal bands, maybe hip hop crews, would have had jobs like plumber or builder or construction worker or lorry driver, regular working class jobs, in other words. My dad was a mechanic. I would have expected to find that sort of job. But I realized that we don't find this, and it's a very strange thing. What we do find is plenty of generals, admirals, lieutenant colonels, judges, Freemasons, politicians, diplomats, jobs of this sort of nature. And one or two of them you could write off as a curiosity. But when
Yeah.
it keeps happening, you start to see a trend and a pattern emerging. And if you're going to be mature about it, and if you're going to be sensible, you have to join the dots and say, hang on a minute, there's something going on here. What first alerted me to this dynamic was the work of Dave McGowan on his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which chronicled the mid to late 1960s rock music scene coming out of Laurel Canyon, this neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills in Los Angeles. And McGowan highlighted in that book how pretty much all of the musicians that populated that scene have dads that ticked those boxes, coming out of expressions of the military or military intelligence or other expressions of the establishment. In other words, not the sort of jobs that you would have expected rock
Yeah.
musicians' dads to have. I wouldn't anyway. And so I delved further into this and I realized it wasn't just limited to Laurel Canyon in the 1960s. We find this dynamic everywhere. And again, it's not every musician out there, but it's enough to make me realize that there's something going on here. And so the central contention of my books is that A-list household name musicians don't get to the top of their field through hard work and crossing their fingers for good luck alone. It's not that they're the best musicians out there. We probably all know of musicians that are much better than the ones we've all heard of, but they never get a break. They never become famous. Why?
Yeah.
Because they don't come from the right families, or they've not sold their soul for fame and fortune, which is an expression that can be taken metaphorically or literally. And the ones that do make it often come from these important bloodline families. So they're elevated to these positions of prominence and they are handed these careers on a plate. These careers are ready made for them by those that can make these sort of things happen. Because unfortunately, the music industry, like every other expression of organized society, is not organic and grassroots. So you don't get to the top just by being the best in your field or working really, really hard. You get to the top of your field because you've been selected to be an asset to push the various agendas that these industries are there for. It's the same in the movie industry, it's the same with television, it's the same with the mainstream media, and it's there big time in the music industry. The music industry is there to push social engineering agendas, to change people's perceptions and ideas and value systems very discreetly and under the radar, all under the guise of entertainment, and to help push so-called globalist New World Order agendas. You know, I'm sorry that's bad news for people to hear. I didn't make it that way. I wish it was some other way, but
Yeah.
I'm merely reporting on what I've found. And so now I'm on the fourth book because there's so much to say about this. And the reason I've churned out four books, I had intended to cap it at three, but it's because the information just never stops. I've heard you comment many times about you get emails every single day.
Yes.
Richard,
Yes.
look at this, watch this video, have a look at this book, listen to what this person has to say. It's the same with me. It just never ends. And it got to a point where I had so many hundreds of pieces of information that I thought, well, it's actually my duty to report this and share it widely, not to sit on it just for myself. And for whatever reason, I've just become the go-to guy for communicating all this stuff in the music industry. So another book it is.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure it's just as exciting read and revelationary as all the previous three. Can I ask you this question? Because driving up and down the country, as both you and I do, to go and do talks and various things, occasionally I'll put on the radio when things are a little bit boring. And there are stations now, it seems, dedicated to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And some of these stations even have no adverts on it, which is, in some respects, a blooming relief. However, listening to what you've been saying there, clearly the music is still being regurgitated from the past, and we're still enjoying it, or a lot of people are enjoying it, not realizing that this social engineering or the messaging is still hypnotically being used to us as we listen to that music. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, because music and popular culture and entertainment are the perfect vehicles to get social engineering and mass mind control done. Because people are off their guard. Nobody's expecting to have their entire value systems shaped and molded for them when they're listening to a favorite piece of music or watching a movie or relaxing with a TV show after a hard day at work. It gets you on a subliminal level, and they employ very clever methods to get inside people's consciousness. So some of it happens on an unseen level in terms of the recordings, particularly with what we were talking about earlier, digital electronic formats. So in the same way that information can be taken out of a digital recording without anyone noticing, so this is what happens with MP3 encoding. So a system, I use iTunes myself, will take a large full format file, a WAV file or an AIF file, and all the information is there. But in order to make the file smaller, so it's more manageable, it can be uploaded and shared easier, it strips out certain information. And the system determines, it's basically AI, determines what information can be taken out without the human noticing, without the human ear recognizing it. And unless you're very vigilant and you know what you're listening for, the recording will sound exactly the same, but a lot of it is gone. So if that can happen without people noticing, then the opposite can be happening as well. So stuff can be getting stripped into recordings without people noticing. Harmful frequencies, harmful energetic vibrations, and all these other techniques that can be used. And that can be affecting people on a particular level. And then you can have very sly, very subtle social engineering going on where certain ideas are getting pushed through the lyrics. And if you're paying attention, you realize that, hang on a minute, all the groups that are prominent at this time are pushing these same sort of ideas. This is what they were doing in the 60s with sex and drugs and rock and roll. They were normalizing that through rock music, also through movies, which shows you that the movie industry works in tandem with the music industry to push certain ideas. And we're getting that now. Yeah. We're getting that now with the pushing of things like transhumanism, the glorification of AI, particularly in what passes for so-called urban music, R&B, hip-hop, reggae. It's nothing of the sort. It bears no relation to what went before. But you've now got these bloody awful vocal systems, this one called auto-tune.
Oh, yes, I've heard of that. Never seen it, but I've heard people talk about it.
Exactly. It makes so-called rappers and so-called singers sound like gibbering robots. And this has been going on for years. And the idea is to enforce to the current generation, they're called Gen Z these days, that electronic ways of doing things are great. Hey, kids, listen to how your favorite singer sounds when plugged into a system that makes them into a robot. Isn't it cool? And,
right.
You know, of course, electronic ways of doing things are being pushed to young people generally in absolutely everything. That's why they're all walking around listening to music on phones. So this is an agenda. It's a classic example of an agenda where all the prominent artists in a particular field are on board with the same ideas and the same sounds. And this proves to you, if you're paying attention and if you're prepared to go where the information takes you, that is an agenda. It's not these artists deciding, hey, I think I'm going to plug myself into auto-tune. It sounds really good. First of all, it doesn't. And secondly, if all the artists are doing it, well, have they all had that idea at the same time? Or are they all being instructed to sound this way by those that really control the industry? You know?
Was there a decade that did more damage, do you think, or was more pushy on the messaging that they were doing. I mean, I understand, as you say, that the 60s was pushing rock and roll, and we can all sort of remember 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's funny because somebody said to me, since we got into 2000, just on fashion, you can always recognize if somebody is sort of emulating the 60s, or you watch a film, yeah, that's 60s, that's 70s. But it's much harder in the last 25 years to sort of go, oh, was that before 2010 or after 2010? I don't know whether that's the same musically. But going back to my original question, was there a decade that was really, now looking back, very noticeably pushing big agenda messaging?
I think decades now have become far less definable than they used to. So
Yeah.
for me, the 2000s is just one big sort of homogenized mess. I don't really make too much distinction between 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020. It's all just kind of samey. It's very difficult to identify trends and movements and fads and scenes like you used to. You used to have new romantic and punk and post-punk and new wave and synth pop and all this sort of thing. These days, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting old, but it just all sounds the same to me.
But 100 years ago, you say, oh, 20s music, you instantly got an idea in your head what
Yeah.
what 20s, 100 years, 30s, 40s, and up the decades. And now suddenly it's like we've got no imagination left. And I wonder if that's on purpose.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure everything's just been chucked into one big melting pot in the 2000s. As you say, you can mention a decade going back prior to 2000, and they're very definable. So 80s,
Yeah.
everyone knows what 80s music sounds like. You could listen to a track in a pub or a restaurant or something, and if it's from the 1980s, you know it's from the 1980s. It's just got that sound about it. And then, 90s, people will think of Britpop, Oasis, Blur, maybe these sort of bands, or grunge, Nirvana, somebody like that, or the drum and bass and the garage music that was around in the 90s. And 70s, 70s rock has a particular sound to it. Everyone knows a 60s track when they hear one. And just thinking about your question there, previously, I would probably have highlighted the 1960s as the one that was doing the most damage, if you like, and was employing the most social changes. But thinking about it, I think you'd probably have to go back to the 1950s, because that was laying the foundations for what would come in the 60s. And really, you have to go to 1955, because if you start off in 1950, the music that was around then for the first 5 years of that decade was post-war, and it was very kind of austere and very traditional and very conservative. Pop music hadn't really come in the first part of the 1950s. It all occurred from about 1955 onwards. So you had Bill Haley and his Comets. It used to be Bill Haley and the Comets before the Mandela effect came in and changed all that. These days you won't find any reference to Bill Haley and the Comets. It's his Comets. And so he came in with Rock Around the Clock in 1955. Prior to that, he'd just done Shake, Rattle and Roll in 1954. And I really feel that group was laying the foundations for the emergence of Elvis Presley the following year. So Elvis broke through in 1956 and became an overnight phenomenon. And any group or any artist that becomes an overnight phenomenon is clearly being handled by the social engineers that we have in this world, because there's no way anyone could achieve that under their own steam. So 1956, and then you get other rock and roll artists like Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry and people like this. And by that point, youth culture had changed beyond recognition. So the stuff that Elvis was doing in 1956 would have been shocking a few years before, 1952, 1953.
Now, just going back to the nature of the name of your title of your book, was Elvis's father a plumber or some such, or do you know what his father did?
Not aware that he was a plumber. I know he became Elvis's manager, Vernon Presley. I can't quite pinpoint what he did before that, but I think he was more or less working class from what I gather.
Right, so that's a sort of a genuine young lad, did good, but picked up and then manipulated Elvis from an ordinary family. But going to what you're saying with the sort of bands, I suppose in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they were coming from more elite families.
Well, the thing about Elvis Presley is that his career was handled by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. wasn't a real colonel. He was a Dutchman. And he turned up on American shores under very dubious circumstances. He seems to have had quite a shady past. And he becomes a perfect candidate for having been blackmailed or coerced into doing some work for the military intelligence establishments. So he was given the nickname of Colonel, and he was sort of given to Elvis to manage his career, and he was with him throughout his career. And so much of what Elvis was doing was being dictated by this guy, Colonel Tom Parker. So his father, in such circumstances, largely becomes redundant because Parker was dictating the way that Elvis would go and what agendas he would be pushing. So by the time Elvis came along and all these other contemporary rock and roll artists, popular culture had changed beyond all recognition, and the drugs were coming in, amphetamines and uppers. These sort of drugs were very popular at the time, and lewd sort of sexual performances on stage were coming in, which would have been unthinkable just a couple of years earlier.
Yeah.
And this is why I say that the foundations were being laid for what would become later in the 1960s. And a bit of sort of preparatory work was being done in the 1950s. So clearly it had already been decided by then that popular music was going to be used to change youth culture and change attitudes towards all kinds of things. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, family relationships, the youthful generation's place in the world compared to the value system that their parents represented. And the 60s was just kind of continuing that, really. But I think you have to go back to those mid-1950s. And so my research pretty much starts there. I start in 1955. Not to say that there wasn't stuff going on before that. Of course there was. But that's not really my bag. I mean,
Right.
popular music. So I start in 1955. Somebody else can cover the period before that. Somebody else can do that job.
Someone else can do that. So, I mean, you mentioned that the bands are sort of like with Elvis there are being handled and everything's on a plate. Now, knowing what trying to do your own thing as a writer yourself and myself as a performer and things, if something is given to you on a plate, there comes a point, it certainly seems to me, that you saying, well, it's all very well us doing this, but I want to show myself, my mettle, for what it's worth. And you do get bands, it seems, and this is not my area of expertise by anything. Anybody who knows me knows I'm not very good at music, of course. But when I've heard, having listened to your stuff, and I hear things like, is it Freddie Mercury, I Want to Break Free? And you do wonder, is he talking about I want to break free from the management and all the ways that he's being treated? Or is it just a nice, gentle song about him wanting to break free from a relationship or whatever it is actually about?
Yeah, that song could well be coded. I think it was John Deacon from the band, the bassist, that wrote that particular song. But if we go back to Queen's best known song, Bohemian Rhapsody,
Right.
when you break down the lyrical content in that song, which is the first record I ever bought, by the way, when I was 5 on 7-inch vinyl.
You were 5?
Yeah, I trotted down to
Wow.
Woolworths with my pocket money, and I'd heard this song on Top of the Pops. It was number one for 9 weeks in the winter of 1975, over Christmas 1975. And I used to watch it every week on Top of the Pops with the video, and it scared me to death. It was so creepy. But something about it just appealed to me. And I said to my parents, can I buy this record? And they said, go on then. I think it was 35p or something like that. So
Wow.
down to the local Woolworths it was. And when you do a lyrical breakdown of that song, it really does come across as Freddie talking about a Faustian bargain. So this is the so-called deal with the devil, when artists of all varieties, not just musicians, but painters, sculptors, actors, seem to make some sort of deal with what Bob Dylan once described as the chief commander of this world and of the world we can't see. Those are his words in an interview describing how his career got off the ground. When you look at Bohemian Rhapsody, that's what the song seems to be about. And when you get to the opera section, that's been interpreted as a battle between the forces of good and evil. That's why you've got these angelic sort of choirs.
Right, yes.
One minute they sound menacing, like they're demonic. The next minute they sound sort of more reassuring, like they're angelic choirs. And it's the forces of good and evil battling for Freddie's soul. And in the song, he's telling the story about how he metaphorically just killed a man. He says, "Mama, I just killed a man." He's talking about himself, and he's talking about having killed his old persona, his old life, and he's done it in exchange for this engineered career. And I've got a clip that I show in some of my public talks where Freddie is on stage at one of Queen's early gigs, and he says, "Do you like my claws?" And he's got these sort of false nails, and he says, "I was given these by the devil himself." And then he goes,
Blimey.
you don't believe me. They don't believe me," he says. And it's almost as if he's telling you what he's done, that he made a deal in exchange for engineered fame and fortune. And in my books and in my talks, I argue that this is something that actually goes on. And people think it's metaphorical and it's just talking about people making really bad deals with record companies. But as anyone familiar with my content will know, I argue that the industry is run by dark occultists, and they adhere to religious belief systems and rituals and such. And so there's a very real sense in which artists do sell their souls in exchange for these engineered careers. And it can never be worth it because it never ends up well. But
No.
at the time, they seem to think that, oh, this is great. I'm going to have all the wealth and all the prominence and all the women or whatever their preference may be, and yachts and mansions. But the price that you have to pay in exchange for all of that can never be worth it, as many a musician has discovered to their peril.
So a song like Bohemian Rhapsody would presumably have to be approved by the dark forces, whomever, and would know if that was a coded message, do you think? Were artists at some point in their career beginning to regret what they had done, seeing through the veil, as it were, and trying to perhaps put into the music messages to say, help, I need to get out of all of this? And yet at the same time, of course, that's all very obvious to anybody listening to it.
I'm sure that goes on. And if we stay with Queen for a moment, they put out a song which was the B-side to Radio Gaga off their Works album. And they performed this song at Live Aid as well. Queen's performance at Live Aid was absolutely iconic. Most people agree that it was the best performance of that concert. It was the defining moment in Freddie Mercury's career, and it kind of revived Queen for the next few years until Freddie died. But they put out this song called "Is This the World We Created?" It's a very short song. It's acoustic guitar. It's Brian May on the guitar and Freddie doing the vocals. And they're basically mourning the state of the world. And they're saying, look what humanity has done. Look at everything we've destroyed. Look at everything we've squandered. I mean, you come to realize that it's not humanity that does these things. It's the so-called elite ruling class. It's the parasites and the psychopaths that we have that cause all these things. But either way, it's a very deep, reflective song. And it seems to hint at Freddie, who wrote it, having some regrets about things that he was involved with and trying to make amends through putting a song like this out. And another great song that Queen put out was "These Are the Days of Our Lives." And this was released right before Freddie died. If you look at the video to that song, he's basically a dead man walking. He's wasting away. He just looks like a skeleton. And he had a few days to live when that video was made. And he seems to be full of regret. But at the same time, it's a beautiful song because it's talking about life and what life is, and we reflect on things and we grow older and we wonder what it's all about, and we hold on to the things that have some value to us. It's a wonderful song. So on the one hand, you have Queen putting out some pretty dodgy songs because Brian May wrote one called "Tie Your Mother Down," which I talk about in the book. And he's got lyrics in there like, "It's gotta be tonight, my little school babe. I'm burning up inside. Ain't no way I'm going to miss out this time." So
Gosh.
It's fairly obvious what he's talking about there.
Yes.
It's a pretty unsubtle song. But then on the flip side of that, you have these beautiful reflective songs. And you find this with most groups. In the canon of most major groups' work, you will find songs that perhaps are pushing social engineering agendas and aren't too clever. But you'll also find the odd melancholic, whimsical, kind of beautifully poetic song. And I do think that the record companies, those that control these assets, allow them to put the odd song out. As long as they, for the most part, push these agendas, every now and again they'll be allowed some artistic freedom to express themselves the way they really want to. It's like a little bonus prize, a little scrap from the table in return for them being good little assets, I think that's what goes on.
Has any of the big named artists then whistleblowed and told the story, pretty much as you're saying to us, that this is what's happened to me, and have they managed to get their story out? Or if they have, has it been quickly, like we were talking about, all books withdrawn and burned so nobody knows?
Well, there are some examples of artists that have spoken out about stuff that goes on and stuff that they've seen behind the scenes. So a good example from the COVID years was Eric Clapton. So Eric Clapton came out and did an interview for a documentary film where he talked about his regrets over having taken what the Sheep Farm boys call the arm spears, the 3-dart finish. And he said famously that he lost the use of his hands for a time because they just went numb and he couldn't feel them. And he feared that he would never play the guitar again. And so he spoke about this in this documentary film very candidly, very openly, but that's where it ended. He did this one interview and no more. And I actually tried reaching out to Eric Clapton's management, hoping that he would come on my podcast and do a further interview to talk about this. And it very quickly got shut down by gatekeepers. Van Morrison also spoke out during the COVID era about lockdowns, and he's very critical of what was being done to us and the way our freedoms were being taken away. And I reached out to Van Morrison. I actually managed to get a phone conversation with him. I chatted to him for about 45 minutes or so, and he demonstrated great knowledge of what was going on. He talked about the Who and Klaus Schwab and all them, and he knew exactly who these people were and what these agendas were. And I said to him, would you be prepared to come on record and do a podcast with me talking about all this stuff? And he said, you've got to speak to my management company, they'll sort it all out. So reached out to the management company, gatekeeper steps in, sorry, Van can't do it because of this reason, that reason, he's too busy, whatever, just got shut down. Same thing with Ian Brown, formerly of the Stone Roses. Ian Brown was very outspoken on social media about stuff, so I tried to reach out to him. PR agent, public relations, steps in, sorry, Ian's not doing interviews at the moment. Great public relations. How does this guy earn his money? So that's what happens when artists seem to want to speak out and have something to say. A gatekeeper will step in and shut it down. Occasionally you get artists who do manage to get a message out. So an example I give in the new book is Matt Bellamy of the group Muse. Muse had some great songs on one of their previous albums. They had a song called MK Ultra, where they're talking about that CIA-sponsored mind control program. They had a song called Uprising. Matt Bellamy came out some years ago saying he felt that 9/11 was an inside job orchestrated by elements of the American government.
Good heavens.
Exactly. What happens? A short while later, through the NME music paper, Matt Bellamy delivers another interview where he says he was mistaken and he got caught up in conspiracy culture, and now we can see, of course, that it's all nonsense, and he accepts the official version of 9/11 after all. So if you do manage to get a message out, clearly you're very quickly brought back into line. I've also got the example of Roisin Murphy, who was a vocalist with the group Moloko. She made some comments on her own personal Facebook page, not a corporate page, giving her own views on puberty blockers being administered to young people. And she said that she thought it was disgraceful, it was wrong, this should not be happening. She very quickly got cancelled by BBC Six Music, who were due to feature an entire evening of her programmes. So they shut that down and replaced her with a different artist. And then what do you find? A short while later, Roisin Murphy pops up on social media and says that she was mistaken and she apologises. So that seems to be what happens to you if you stray from the path and, dare to express your own views on things. Got some good reminders there. So that's why the messages don't really ever get through. You do occasionally get artists like Shane Lynch, who was in the boy band Boyzone. He came out last year, having become a born-again Christian, and he stated that basically the music industry is demonic and it's used to push satanic agendas. And he singled out Taylor Swift as an artist who pushes dark occult rituals through her performances. And going back a few years prior to that, you had Brian Harvey of the group East 17, who really seems to have suffered for speaking out about what he was a part of. He said at one point that he was in fear for his life, and he'd had various mental health breakdowns as a result of trying to speak out about the industry. So it seems to be a very risky thing when you do stick your head above the parapet if you have become a household name artist. And that's perhaps makes it understandable why so few of them do it. We get so few examples of those that are prepared to speak out. A heavy price, it seems, has to be paid.
And talking of that heavy price, I mean, I don't know how much one can really say on this, but we have had a number of well-known artists die in strange circumstances, let's say. And, you know, they seem to be perfectly normal accidents or just, you know, come to the end of their life or a health problem or something that couldn't possibly be any more than that. But every time I hear them, and as I said earlier, it's not my genre really. I've sort of managed to avoid being influenced by any of the sort of pop music. But there was a guy, I forget which band it was, who recently fell off a balcony under strange circumstances. And of course, for me, being somewhat cynical to whatever comes out mainstream news, as I'm sure it is with you and many of the viewers here, will be going, uh-oh, I wonder what was behind that then. Because it does seem that if you're famous and a genuine accident happens, let's say, you can't really take it at face value anymore.
That's right. So that was Liam Payne of the group One Direction.
Oh, he went in one direction.
Well, yeah. He just happened to fall off a balcony, we're told, in a hotel in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in October last year. It's not that he'd been particularly outspoken about the industry and stuff that goes on in it, but he just appears to be someone that had outlived his value to the industry. So One Direction broke up some years ago, and Liam Payne seems to have outlived his usefulness. You can then take it to artists like, for example, Prince, Michael Jackson, and George Michael, all of whom became very outspoken about their respective record labels. So George Michael and Michael Jackson were signed to the Sony Corporation, not necessarily the luckiest record label to be signed to. They had a few things to say about the nature of the contracts that corporation held its artists in. And they were trying to win back some artistic freedom for themselves, some autonomy, and to gain back their master tapes and control over their music publishing and things of this nature. And we all know how it ended up for each of them, if we accept the official versions. And we could take that dynamic all the way back to the 1960s, because the same sort of thing happened with three very prominent soul artists. So we got James Brown, Otis Redding, and Sam Cooke. And round about 1964, these three artists were attempting to unite and come up with their own record label and their own music publishing company, and to break away from their respective music industry homes. And they were just trying to regain some creative autonomy in the same way that Prince and Michael Jackson were a generation later. Didn't end well for any of them, surprise, surprise. So Sam Cooke in December 1964 got shot to death in a motel when it was claimed that he was trying to sexually molest a young woman that he'd taken back there after a night out at a club. And he was apparently shot by the motel manageress when this young woman came to the office running for help. Sam Cooke came running after her, and the manageress, in this chaos that ensued, shot Sam Cooke to death, we're told. There's all kinds of anomalies and discrepancies with that story. Why wouldn't there be? And reasons to believe that it's not as clear-cut as people were told it was through the mainstream media. Then, 3 years on from that, in December 1967, Otis Redding died in a plane crash when the light aircraft he was travelling in went down over a lake in Wisconsin. It also killed the soul group the Bar-Kays at the same time. James Brown's fate, it seems, was different. So he was left alive, and he was pretty much forced to perform and be an asset of the industry for the next 30-odd years. And he became what was known as the hardest working man in show business. That was his nickname, but possibly not through choice. So he was doing tours and churning out albums and shows all the way through until his death in December 2006. So all these three artists died in the month of December. And you come to realize that the occult controllers of the music industry do a lot of their stuff according to ritual dates, which are very significant and very important to them. So James Brown died in hospital. He went in for what should have been a routine operation and came out in a body bag. And so that's all three of those artists who had dared to go up against the controllers of the industry machine, and that was their ultimate fate. So it seems that these occurrences are sent out as a possible warning sign for any other artists who might think, oh, we're going to break away from the industry and do things under our own terms, as a little reminder of what might happen to you if you dare to go up against the industry. So, as I said before, there's a line. And once these artists cross that certain line, they are completely owned, completely controlled, and there's no way of ever going back. Many of these artists have thought that they can go back, but they come to discover that there's no way back. And I think when you get to the likes of, for example, the Rolling Stones, Sir Mick Jagger and the rest of the Stones, you get the surviving Beatles, Sir Paul McCartney, if that's who it really is. That's a different show.
Yes.
Sir Ringo Starr, Sir Elton John, Sir Rod Stewart, Sir Tom Jones, Sir Cliff Richard. When you get to artists of that ilk, is there a trend emerging here? I can't they know better than to go against their controllers, their paymasters, their overlords. They know to just keep performing. That's why most of them are still out on stage into their 80s, still doing tours, slogging it out on the circuit, because they know you don't go up against these people. You do what you're told. And if you do what you're told, you can get the mansions and the yachts and the women and the drugs. But unfortunately, you no longer have a mind or a soul to call your own. And if we think back to 2020 and all the stuff that was getting pushed then, all these assets, all these household names were singing from the same hymn sheet. They were all absolutely on message with the very same stuff that was getting put out there, all the propaganda, not one dissenting voice. Or if there were dissenting voices, they were the ones that we spoke about earlier, Van Morrison, Eric Clapton, and we know what happened to them. They're still alive, but they don't really talk about this stuff anymore.
Closed down. So let's bring it right up to date as we're coming towards the end of the show, as it were. I mean, we talked about how the internet and digital technology has sort of killed the sound of the music in the past and the quality and perhaps the full body of the frequencies and stuff. In theory, and this is what I want to ask you, it's opened up the ability for somebody like my children, let's say, or your children or whoever's children, to be able to put together with a few bits of equipment, quite simply, a drum, a keyboard, and maybe a flute or whatever it is, a hit song, and with the power of the internet, have it round and it becomes a success. Has that threatened the dark forces who's controlled the industry up until this point? And is it liberating, or do you think that still all of that is very much under their manipulation and control?
There are levels to everything, so it's a hierarchy. And when you get to the realm of the people like Beatles and Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, obviously they're top league, and everything is going to be done on the record company's terms. They'll be allowed some artistic creative freedom, as I said, and to put out some songs that they feel to put out. But if you go several levels down in the hierarchy, you find entry level and mid level. Like I said, there's a point, there's a line. Once you cross the line, you're owned. If you stay below the line, you might be able to carve out a decent career for yourself. And this is a good sort of parting message for any budding, aspiring musicians or producers or DJs. Because you can now produce music relatively cheaply and simply on your own terms, you might be able to get a song out there and it will be relatively organic. It might flourish on its own without any input from these major corporations. And that might be enough to enable somebody to make a decent career for themselves, have enough money coming in to pay the bills and get reinvested into making future music. And they might be able to play gigs and have a relatively decent career. My advice is always to any artist or any bands, just become wary of any offer that you might get made that feels too good to be true. Some advice my old dad used to give to me was, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. and there's no such thing as a free lunch. So if somebody's offering you the world, it's going to come at a price. Nobody offers you the world and doesn't want anything back for it.
Something, yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah. So you're going to know the offer when it comes because the industry employs spotters, and it's their job to turn up at gigs and keep an eye on which artists are creating a little bit of a buzz, a little bit of a stir under their own steam. And they'll report back to their corporate overlords and say, yeah, I saw this great band. I think they've got a really good sound and they're very creative. And that's when the record company might reach out to this band and say, hey, come in for a meeting. We think that you could be of some use to us and we could really help your career to skyrocket. Be very wary of that kind of offer when it comes in. But if you can fly below the radar and just kind of bubble along under your own steam, then you could have a very fulfilling career for yourself. You're not going to become megastars, you're not going to become millionaires, but if it's enough for you to just be creative and be authentic and not sell out, and you get fulfillment and satisfaction from putting out certain messages, then these days you can carve out a pretty decent career for yourself, I feel. You and I both do a lot of festivals in the summer. And we see many of these bands and many of these artists who make authentic truth music, conscious message music, and they're not signed to any of these major corporations. They do it all under their own steam. And I'm sure if we speak to many of these people, they will say that they're very happy with the way that they put out their music. They're very happy with the way their career has turned out. And there's no reason why many more artists and bands couldn't be doing it on that kind of basis. I've got a conscious message music showcase, which I call the Sound of Freedom, which I've been running since 2013. And it's my way of showcasing artists who are not necessarily signed to major record corporations, but who have something really good to say and put out great music. And it's like a one-stop shop for putting all that stuff out there. And more artists are just kind of stepping up and doing things under their own energy, you know, without wanting to be beholden to one of these corporations. That's the way I do my books. I self-publish my books. I mean, I put them on Amazon, but I've not gone through any conventional publisher. I don't have a literary agent, because the minute you sign up to a literary agent, they're going to want to try and control over what you put out. Yeah, they'll be like, I don't think you should say this and take that out and maybe put this in. I don't want that kind of control. I want to say whatever I want to say in my books, and I do. And if I can achieve that through my books, then artists can achieve it through their albums. And it's a great way to go. And if there is a benefit to everything going digital and electronic, it is that it brings a high level of autonomous ability for us creative types to put out a message on exactly the terms we want it to be on without corporate manipulation. You didn't used to be able to put out an album without signing to one of the major record companies, but you can now, and you can do the same with books.
And the interesting thing about the sort of the digital world and the little golf balls that we all end in, or the goldfish bowls, the sort of what do you call it when you're in I can't remember the term now, when they say, oh, you're just talking to yourself, or you're talking to your same audience. Echo chamber, thank you. When you're in that sort of echo chamber. But if your audience is there, and you've got a book, or you've got a music album, and they stay with you, and you've built up your followers, let's say, that's really good. And the nice thing, and I've had a sample of this, somebody said to me at an event, they said, Richard, what's it like to be famous? And I said, what do you mean? When I'm famous, I'll tell you. They said, but you are famous. I said, but I'm only famous to you because you watch my videos. Thank God I'm not famous to everybody else, because how awful would that be, walking down the street to go and buy a bag of potatoes and everybody's on your case. When we go to these, I mean, and you'll go to one of these truth events or these festivals, and suddenly everybody wants to talk to you, which is lovely. But when you're out there in the main real world, it's nice to have that anonymity, just to go and be like everyone else. And if you do become too famous and you can't cope with that, and everybody's on your case, and you've got to have bodyguards and all, I just cannot think how awful your life must be when you just cannot nip down the pub and have a discreet pint.
Well, exactly. And it's probably the same for you as it is for me these days. You go to one of these festivals or these conferences, and it can literally take you half an hour to get from one side of the room to the other just to go to the toilet, Because everyone's like, "Oh,
Absolutely.
Richard, oh, I saw your video, and
Yes.
let me tell you this." Or people are lovely. They bring you gifts, and it's really nice of them. But they'll say, "Oh, here's a bar of soap that I cooked up, and I'd like you to have it." And here's a pot of jam that I made, and it's really nice of people, but it just takes you ages to get anywhere. And
And
that's at our level, and we're not famous, as you say. We're
exactly. I
well
mean,
known within a particular very, very small
very tiny
yeah,
niche.
exactly. But imagine somebody like Mick Jagger. He can't go down the local
No.
co-op for a sandwich. He just can't do it. And I'm sure
Because
that
you've
must be
got
a
the
nightmare.
paparazzi as well following you, and and you've seen these pictures where they say, "Oh, there's Mick Jagger going in. Look, doesn't he look miserable? His life must be,
Yeah,
down." And he's just like, "I've just got up,
yeah.
I've just got up."
And you get scrutinized. They're like, "Oh, look, he's wearing his tracksuit bottoms, and what a mess his hair is." Or, with women, "Oh, no makeup. Look at the state of her hair." And maybe you don't
Yeah,
want that. You don't want to be scrutinized like that when you just walk down the street. So I'm sure the price of fame for many of these artists is an absolute nightmare,
yeah.
because their lives are no longer their own.
But kids, it's interesting. Kids these days, what do you want to do when you grow up? That sort of eternal question. They say, "Oh, I want to be famous," or "I want to be a social media influencer," or one of these things. And you just think, my God, you have no idea.
Exactly. And this is a sort of Cinderella fairy story that's peddled particularly to young girls. Like, you could be the next Rihanna, you could be the next Beyonce. All you've got to do is want it hard enough.
Yeah.
And these young
And
girls,
sign on the dotted line.
it sounds great to them. You could be the next Taylor Swift, and it sounds like all their dreams coming true at the same time. And wouldn't it be so marvelous if they could achieve that? And I'm sure that's how they lure many of these assets in.
Yes.
Promise them the world and promise them all this fame and fortune and prominence and stuff. And I'm sure so many of them, when they actually make it, wish that they hadn't. I'm sure there are so many pop princesses, Britney Spears, Taylor Swift, take your pick, who wish they could just be normal like the rest of us. They wish they could walk down the street to the local supermarket without being mobbed by
Yeah.
paparazzi, but it's too late for them now.
Yeah. I mean, we don't realise just how lucky we are to be able to do that and have that anonymity. We're coming to the end. No One's Dad is a Plumber is the name of the book. Mark Devlin. He's also got 3 other startlingly good books to go and look at. Where can people find your books?
So they are on Amazon, and some people may shudder at the mention of that company, but the reality of the situation is, if you want to be successful as an author, you have to go on Amazon. You just have to. It's the best way of getting books out. I mean, even if you didn't want to go through Amazon, it becomes the only reliable method of getting books out in other parts of the world. So
Yeah.
I've tried mailing out personal copies of my book to people in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They never get there. They just don't get there.
I've heard that from John Hamer as well. He said the same.
Exactly. So they might take 6 weeks to arrive, and then they'll get seized by customs. And customs will contact the author, and they'll say, "You've got to pay 100 quid for this book to be released." And it becomes so much of a headache that the best advice to people in those areas of the world is just get it from Amazon. It's the best way of getting hold of
Yeah.
it. I can mail out copies to people in the UK and most of Europe. That's not really a problem. It's just these far-flung parts of the world. So it's on Amazon. You can get copies from me personally if you want to drop me an email. My email address is markdevlin2022 at gmail.com, protonmail.com. I'm sure you'll put that in the notes below.
Yeah.
And
And you'll give a signed copy for that,
Oh,
will you?
absolutely. Yeah, I'll sign them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you
People love
catch me out and about at many of these gigs that I do, speaking events, festivals, conferences, of course, you can get copies there. So tell me about your book, Richard. I'm sure you've mentioned it before on your show, but what is this, memoirs?
It's not.
Or what?
It's not quite ready yet. Mine is Biggleswick, the town that wouldn't comply. It's a
Oh,
novel.
yes, I remember you talking about that.
So yes, it's still. I think it won't be ready now till the autumn. To be honest with you, ready for Christmas.
And will you be doing an audiobook version of it?
I will. I do want to do an audiobook. Well, that's going to take another, arm and a leg, because there's all sorts of different voices to do in there. I will enjoy it, but I do need to block out the time and just go, right, I've got to do this over this month or
Nice
whatever.
little winter project for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. But thank you for plugging my book.
Well, yeah,
as
no,
well.
no
That's-
worries. And actually, audiobooks have become a very important part of being an author these days. A lot of people like to absorb books in an audio format. And
Yes, I
so
can.
you really do need to
And
go
you
to the
have an
site.
audiobook?
Not for this one yet. I've not got round to it yet. I've got audiobook versions of all my other books. I'll be doing this one in the winter. So by the end of the year, hopefully there will be an audiobook.
And do you do them yourself? You
Yes.
don't rely on AI voices and all this?
Absolutely not. I narrate on myself. It does take a very long time. It's very arduous and very laborious, but it is worth it in the end. You just
Yeah.
kind of have to do it these days.
Absolutely. And anybody who doesn't think that it's arduous and difficult, just pick up a book off the shelf and read one page aloud and note, and maybe record yourself on your phone and notice how many hiccups and breaths and pauses or misunderstanding of the line that you do. It is, I have done 2 audio books, and at the last one I said, never again. Never, because it's kind of worse when it's your own, because you know the words and you can then you start changing the bloody lines. That's what I
And
found. It's
people
like,
want to hear the author speaking in their own
yes,
voice. You know, they don't want you to hire a narrator. They want to hear you
no,
do it. And AI doesn't work either. You know, it can clone your voice, but it's never accurate. It doesn't get the little
and
nuances and the little.
it's soulless.
It is soulless. Yeah, absolutely.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us about your book. Is there going to be another one?
I said that after the last one, that there wasn't going to be another one. I said, Musical Truth 3, that's it, I'm done. And the reason I brought this one out is because the information just didn't stop coming. And I thought, well, if I don't put this information out, there's a chance it will get lost to the mists of time. So I kind
Yeah,
of feel a duty to. So,
yeah.
in the words of the James Bond film, never say never again.
I look forward to book 5 then.
I don't.
No, you've got to sit there and write the blooming thing. Mark Devlin, all the links will be in the description, of course. Do and check out those books and get a nice signed one because it's always lovely. Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it. And fascinating conversations as ever. Looking forward to seeing you at some of the events. I'm sure we will. Boogieing along.
Yep.
Until next time, thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be back with more monologues and more wonderful guests. Look after yourself and happy reading this summer. Till next time, goodbye.
Cheers.